The Juneau World Affairs Council and the University of Alaska Southeast, in collaboration with KTOO, present the 2023 World Affairs Forum, Immigration, Detention, and Power, Addressing Bias and Prejudice. In this lecture, The Challenges Faced by Children Arriving to the U.S., internationally recognized children's rights scholar and advocate, Professor Warren Binford, speaks about why so many children are leaving their home countries, why they are coming to the U.S., and the challenges they face once they arrive.
Thank you so much, Heather. It's so good to be with you again today and to be with everyone here in Alaska to talk about the challenges being faced by children arriving to the United States. Before we start to get too far into the substance, I just want to make sure that we all have a shared understanding of the different legal and cultural categories that we have when we view children arriving to the United States. Generally we refer to a child as migration as a child who's on the move, who's crossing international borders for whatever reason. An undocumented child is a child who is not a citizen of the country that they're in and doesn't have government paperwork that explains or identifies a status that they have that's recognized by the government. An asylum seeker is someone who is seeking permission to enter into another country because of a fear of persecution in their home country. A refugee is an asylum seeker who has been granted refuge in a country. An immigrant child is a child who comes to a country in order to live permanently in that country. An unaccompanied child is an undocumented child who is in the process of migration, whose parents are not in the U.S. and is normally in federal government care. An unaccompanied refugee child is a child in migration who's been granted refugee status, and a DACA recipient is a person who was undocumented when they arrived in the United States, but has been given special status in the United States for limited periods that allow their deportation to be deferred because of the circumstances under which they were brought to the United States by their parents. And so when we are talking today, we could be talking about any of these children, because to me, it doesn't really matter what their status is when they arrive to the United States, that every child who arrives to the United States has the right to be treated humanely, has a right to be treated in accordance with both international and national law, and that they all deserve the same care and respect. So let's talk about the children arriving to the United States. When as Heather mentioned, I was first asked to do a border inspection in 2017, and that of course was under the previous administration. And I suspect one of the reasons they reached out to me was because of a law review article that I had written several years prior in 2014. And that was about children's right to representation in the court process, because the immigration judicial process is extremely complicated and children are not given counsel. And it really is impossible to navigate without an attorney to represent them. And so I wrote that in 2014, where you can see on this graph that there was an increase of children arriving to the United States. The reason why I like to use this graph is because it shows you that in 2014, when I wrote that article, we were nowhere near the numbers of people arriving to the United States who were being apprehended at our border because they were coming into the United States without a recognized status. And so that really was happening in the 80s and then at the beginning of the 21st century. And so when this started to happen in 2014, it wasn't the overall number that was significant. It was the fact that a growing number was unaccompanied children. And this is something that we had never seen before, that generally what we tended to see were single adult men who were coming across the border in order to seek work in the United States. And this was a continuing pattern of migration that we intentionally created. Our government intentionally created labor. We entered into labor agreements with Mexico to bring Mexican workers into the United States to fill gaps in our workforce in the mid-20th century. particularly during World War II. And then this pattern has continued with different historical factors at play at different parts of the 20th century. But this is something that we have intentionally created as a society, was a migration of workers going back and forth. But what was different about 2014 is the numbers were relatively low, but we were seeing more children, and we were also starting to see some family groups. But we were very panicked about the children because it wasn't a population that we had seen historically. So when in 2016, when you heard a lot of rhetoric on the campaign trail about, oh, those criminals and those rapists, and they're taking over our country and things like that, I'm thinking, we're seeing really low numbers, historically, relatively speaking, but we're seeing more children. And those children don't appear to be, nearly as threatening as they're being described in this political dialogue that was started then. Nonetheless, I was worried about that dialogue because the research indicates that you increase irregular migration when you threaten shutdowns, when you start to threaten closed borders and harsh restrictions on cross-border migration, you actually, at least in the short term, increase irregular migration, and that's what I was afraid was going to happen. And in fact, that is what we saw happen. In the the initial year after the election, we saw a brief drop in migration, and then just what we anticipated happened, which is that there was a sharp increase in migration. And part of the theory is that many people thought, okay, this is my last chance, and I have a horrific situation at home, and so I've got to go now. We created a certain amount of anxiety, which led to an increase in migration. And sure enough, as I pointed out, we saw this increase in the couple of years after that rhetoric was promoted, and then, as Heather referred, we had a drop in 2020 because of the pandemic and the fact that we severely limited migration into the United States based upon a health exemption that we relied on. And then, we then saw migration skyrocket after that. And so now we are past those levels that I pointed to in the 80s and the beginning of the 21st century. And it is theorized that this is happening at least in part because of both the situation in the home countries, which we'll talk about in a second, but also because we've become so aggressive with our immigration policies, and we have families who are split on both sides of the border, that children are trying to reunify with parents and families in the U.S., and that's part of the reason why we are seeing such a large number of unaccompanied children, that green number. And that also includes family unit members. But we're seeing so many more children coming across the border because we have had this cross-border migration going on for so long, and then we had these severe shutdowns and threats of closing the border and things like that. So where are these children coming from? So they're primarily coming from Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And of course, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador are referred to commonly as the Northern Triangle. And you will all recall that the Northern Triangle was a part of the United Fruit Company's control for many years. And as a result of the involvement, interference, dominance, control by American corporate interests, that this region did not experience full and open democratic processes developed in those countries, and our continuing interventions in their politics and things like that have led to a social and political environment that has given rise to gangs, violence, instability, corruption, and in particular, drug dealing. And what we see, of course, is that most of the drugs, and we also see weapons trafficking, but most drug trafficking and weapons trafficking that goes through the Northern Triangles through the gangs, that they are to the United States where they are sold. We are their dominant market. And so this has created conditions in which children have been driven to leave their homes because they have been, the gangs have tried to recruit them, and if you refuse to join a gang, we've interviewed multiple children who you join the gang under threat of death. If you are a girl child, and the gang member chooses to have you as their sex slave, you are their sex slave under threat of death. We have interviewed grandmothers who say, I'm here with my grandchildren because their sister refused to be the girlfriend of a gang member. She was decapitated, her arms and legs were cut off, and so we're now here outside of Tijuana trying to get the other children to safety, to their family in the United States. And so really horrible situations. We've also interviewed girl children where the father is sexually abusing the daughters when they start to go through puberty, and and they are trying to get away from the father because the police will not protect them because of misogyny in the United States and the misogyny in their home countries, and the fact that they're trying to seek safety in the United States. Normally, with family here, approximately 89% of the kids who arrive in the United States undocumented, they have loved ones who are waiting for them in the United States. I've interviewed many children who, when I say, where are you going, who are you going to, they pull out a piece of paper in their pocket and they show me, their mom's number, their dad's number, their grandmother's number. Sometimes they have like those concert bracelets that you get when you go to raves and all that other stuff that I'm sure you're going to go to after this lecture tonight. Like it has their telephone numbers written on it, and then sometimes we even see the Sharpies written directly on their skin, and especially when we were seeing metering at the southern border, that they literally would pass the Sharpies down the row because they knew their children might be separated, and so they would write their telephone number and who the child was, who the parents were, and things like that, because there were people expecting them usually on the other side. In addition, of course, we also have the climate crisis, and increasingly we're hearing from children who are having to leave subsistence farms and communities because of natural disasters directly related to the climate crisis, including farms that aren't able to produce enough food to support their families, and then that combined with the pandemic so that they couldn't go into the cities and their parents couldn't go into the cities and work that way, that they end up coming to the United States because the family could not feed them, that they could not support them, but they had family in the United States who had jobs and could support them up here. And so we're seeing much more migration of children as a result of the climate crisis as well. So if you look at what happens when a child migrates from the Northern Triangle to the United States of America, you will see that they often have to do part of that journey by foot. They often will do part of that journey on a train called La Bestia, which takes them through parts of Mexico, that they often end up getting stuck for some period at the U.S. Mexican border, which on the Mexican side is one of the most dangerous places in the world. Approximately 2/3 of the girls are raped or sexually assaulted during the journey, that oftentimes they have to, or their family has to hire a coyote to try and keep them safe during that journey. And so many people die during that journey that it is considered the deadliest migration route on the planet. This is not an easy trip for anyone to make, especially a child. And many of these children, are without parents during part of that journey. Some are lucky enough to be with their parents, but then once they come to the United States, they're frequently separated, from their parents or other family members that they are for a variety of reasons. When we interview these children, one of the things that we sometimes will do, if the facility will allow us, is let them color while they're talking to us and telling us who they are and about their journey and whether their rights are being respected by the U.S. government. And we don't ask them that question, but we say, are you getting enough to eat? And, are you sleeping well? And things like that. But, what you'll see in the pictures they color is that these kids are just like your children, your grandchildren, your neighbor children, that these are children who generally are loved They have family, they know who their mom and dad are, that they are coming to the United States usually full of hope and wonder about what's here and who they're going to see. Many of them have experienced trauma, as we just talked about, during their migration journey. But they have stories to tell about, the mountains or the bus that they rode on their way here and things like that, that these are, normal children. As a matter of fact, and I'll just go back to this, as a matter of fact, some of the research shows that these children are truly gifted in their level of strength and resilience. That, I love my kids. One of them here is with me in Alaska, and she's not with me right now, so she won't hear me say this, but she's heard me say it before. I have fabulous kids, and I love them so much. But my kids, because of the life that they've had, they do not have the levels of strength and resilience that the children who arrive at the United States southern border are shown to have in studies that have been done with them, that they have exceptional levels of resilience and strength, which makes them a true gift to our society, that they're coming here to be with us and to be a part of our society. And yet that same research shows that because of the way that they are treated upon arrival to the United States, both while in government custody, in government care, and after being released from government care, that the advantages that they had when they arrived to the United States, that they lose, because of the trauma and mistreatment and racism that they experience in U.S. society. So one of the things that happens is that when children first arrive in the United States, they normally, present themselves, because many of them know what to do. They present themselves to Border Patrol, and Border Patrol will often take their belongings, and if the person that they're with, and this depends on the year and sector and officer and what orders are in control at that point in time, but they will often be separated from their family unless it is a parent who can verify their status with like a birth certificate that the Border Patrol agent recognizes as being legitimate. And again, there's been a lot of fluctuation over this for over the last few years, so I don't want to present it as any absolutes, but in any event, many children are separated from their family. And then what happens is those children are often then like grouped together, kind of like the Lord of the Flies. And at this particular facility that I visited, this was the Clint Border Patrol facility, and we went to this facility in June 2019, and we were, we received a report. When I say we, I mean, the attorneys who represent the class of children arriving to the United States who are in government custody. This is the Flores case, and we'll talk about that in a minute. They receive a report once a month about where the children are that day, how many children are there, who they are, et cetera. But then the next day, we don't know where they are. And a week later, we don't know where they are. And 2 weeks later, we don't know what children the government still has, et cetera, and so on. So it's a bit of a cat and mouse game when you're trying to do these visits. So we were told that there were a lot of kids who were in the El Paso sector, but we couldn't figure out where they were, and we were hearing different things about them being kept in the desert and being kept outside and being kept in tents and things like that. And so we were trying to figure out where all of these kids were, and somebody told us the Friday before our arrival on Sunday that they heard that some kids were being kept in the Clint Border Patrol station, which was strange because this facility was meant for about 100 adult men. It wasn't a facility for children. So we notified them that we were going to come, and we notified them on Friday that we were going to come on Monday. And on Monday morning, we walked into this facility, which is one of the nicest, most brand new facilities in the country. It's a LEED building and everything. And we walk in and we say, okay, nice to meet you, and could you give a list of the children who are here? 352 children. And we are scanning either the list, infant, toddler, preschool, kindergartners, elementary school kids, teenagers, teenage moms, and we're like, oh my flipping goodness, where are you keeping all these children? And they said, we can't tell you. like, okay, well, show us. And they said, no, we're not going to show you. You need to stay in this conference room. And so we said, okay, we want you to start bringing us children because we need to figure out what's going on here. Bring us the youngest children, bring us the children who have been here the longest, and bring us the teenage moms, the child mothers. They started bringing us these kids in, and they were absolutely exhausted. They were dirty, they smelled bad, they were hungry. They came in, some of them started to fall asleep on the conference table. They started to curl up in the conference chairs, the conference room chairs. Some of them, we keep food for us during lunch because we sometimes have like 12, 14, 15-hour days, depending on how long they let us stay. And the kids were so hungry that, we did something that we weren't supposed to do, but we gave them food because they were just absolutely exhausted and hungry, and they just started crying. And we started asking, like, where are you from and how long have you been here? And they're like, I've been here 3 weeks, I've been here 3.5 weeks, I've been, have you showered? And then we started finding out that not only did they have 352 kids there, but that over the weekend, in that 72, 60-hour window that they had from when we notified them that we were coming to this facility, they had 24-hour round-the-clock buses coming and picking up 300 other children, 300 to 400 other children, and had been bussing them out all weekend. And then the kids who were there, they brought in showers and said 3-minute showers everybody, and started rotating everybody through these showers, trying to get them cleaned up for our arrival. But they didn't get all the kids out on time, and they didn't get all the kids showered on time. And so we happened upon, what was happening. Because they wouldn't tell us where they were keeping the children, and they wouldn't they wouldn't allow us to leave the conference room. And, and I'm just gonna share openly that the plumbing went out. And so they ended up having to take me throughout the entire facility because the nearest bathroom was on the other side of the ground. So I did, before I left, several days later, I did have a chance to see most of the facility. But in any event, at that time we were locked in the conference room. So after that day of interviewing, we drove around the outside of the building trying to find where the kids were being kept. And we found this, and I'll just go back so you can look at it again. We saw this like corrugated metal building that wasn't part of the brand new, really nice LEED facility, LEED certified facility. And it has virtually no windows other than just that ventilation window over, in the corner. And I was like, are they keeping the kids in there? Like, is that possible? So the next day, I took a whole bunch of pictures from the outside, and the next day we asked the kids, like, show us where you were. And what we found is one of the kids drew this picture of where they were keeping over 100 children, and it, in fact, matched the windowless warehouse right down to the number of bathrooms on the side that we took in the pictures that we had taken the night before from outside the facility, and 2 trailers that the child described, one's for the shower and the other one was for health checkups. And in fact, when you match the child's drawing to the picture we took, you can count nine bathrooms. So like, oh my gosh, that's where they're keeping them. Well, as time went on, and when we collected the other stories from the children, and then the New York Times was able to get a map of the facility, and we were able to verify that the children's accounts of being kept in a loading dock and being kept in basically jail cells and being kept in this windowless warehouse and being kept in tents out in the desert, that it was all true. And and I can remember the New York Times, so these are the tents in the desert that some of the kids were being kept in. There's the shower, and there is the health facility. But when the New York Times was looking at the number of children, or what the fire department allowed as the maximum occupancy for the cells, and then I'm looking at the records of how many children were actually in the cells, that there was often 2.5 to 3 times as many children in the cells as were legally allowed by the fire department. And and so when the children were describing either having to sleep on the floor or having to sleep 4 to a mat, or if they were lucky enough to get a bunk bed, having like kids would not want to get up and go to the bathroom, because if they did, they risked someone else taking their place on the bunk bed. And so they were very afraid to leave that coveted spot because they didn't want to have to sleep on the floor. But these really outrageous conditions, even the New York Times was saying, Warren, could you please verify that you really have 62 children in this cell? Because we're looking at the, what's licensed by the fire department, and it's saying that there are only, 30 allowed in there. And so it really was a horrific and tragic situation. In addition to that, and that's the one where we finally went public. And the reason we went public about that, the Flores lawsuit has been going on since the 1980s, and it was the first time that we had gone public. And the reason was that we, in the year leading up to that visit, had witnessed approximately 7 to 8 children die, either in government care or shortly after being released from government care, for the first time in almost a decade. And we were watching the conditions deteriorate during that time, and we had tried to talk to the government about it, and they would not listen to us. And in fact, we saw, almost intentionally, the conditions worsen, and we were afraid that another child was going to die. And I'm grateful to say that some changes were made, but certainly not enough. Another facility that we went to was a converted Walmart, and here we saw over 1,500 kids who were forced to march in single file lines in uniforms in front of a giant mural of Donald Trump. And I'm trying to remember the exact language on the mural, but it said something like, sometimes in order to win the war, you have to lose a few battles. And the kids had to march single file line past that mural 6 times a day. And it was just incredibly inhumane. And one of the things that I remember hearing from the kids is that many of these kids who were coming particularly from the highlands in Guatemala and other places, that they were indigenous children who spoke indigenous languages, and many of them did not speak Spanish fluently, and sometimes not even well, and they were desperate to hear their own language. And if 2 children from indigenous groups were placed together in the same quarter of the Walmart, that they would explain how they then would be separated and sent to other parts of the Walmart, so that the one person in the facility who could speak their language, they no longer were able to interact with, to have that linguistic and cultural companionship that's so critical to our health and well-being. In addition to that, some kids were being sent to a giant tent city in Tornillo, Texas, which is also near El Paso. And some of the children that we interviewed there had been there for literally 9 months. Now, I liked some things. I've liked some things about every president we've ever had. I dislike some things about every president that we've had. And I will tell you that one of the things that I did not like about President Obama was that when he was president, some of these kids were kept in government care for 30 or more days. And when you think about being kept in these facilities for 4 or 5 weeks, that's outrageous. You can experience some profound trauma as a result of that. And I thought that was so awful. And then our next president was keeping kids in tents in the desert for 9 months. And you think about just the profound isolation and sadness and hopelessness that you experience when you're in that situation, and you can understand how that research shows that strength, that resilience, that optimism that they had when they came to the United States is lost as a result of their mistreatment. In addition to the children, one of the challenges that we faced was that of the parents. So we sometimes would interview the parents who had been separated from their children, and we would hear such despair from the parents about the circumstances under which their children had been taken from them. And we literally would hear how parents would be tricked into giving up their child and be told, oh, we're going to have you go to court now, and we have to put you in handcuffs, and you don't want your little girl to see you like that, do you? And so then the mother would say, well, no, but I'll get to see her right when I come back. And they'd say, of course. And I'm telling you the story of one of the moms we interviewed. This was her story at the Port Isabel Detention Center, where she had been kept for months and months and months after her daughter was taken away from her by the U.S. government. And she came back from that court appearance, and her daughter was gone. And at the point that we saw her, it had been, 3.5 months since she saw her daughter. Her daughter was sent to a family in, I want to say it was like Michigan, who did not speak Spanish. And when the mom told us the story about her bringing her daughter to the United States, it was because the mother had been sexually abused by the uncle when the mother came of age. And that same uncle was starting to eye her daughter, who was like 11, 12 years old and coming of age, and she did not want the same thing to happen to her daughter as happened to her. And then suddenly she was in a situation where her daughter was being kept with a strange man, 1,000 miles away from where this mother was in Texas, and she did not know what that man was doing to her daughter every night in her bedroom at this house that she had never been to. And she could almost never talk to her daughter because of the restrictions on communication imposed by the U.S. government and its privatization of communication lines from detention centers, that it would cost the parents so much money even to talk to their kids for a few minutes, and they were severely limited in their ability to communicate at all with the children who had been taken from them. And then when we'd hear the children and what they told on their side of the story of being separated from their parents, that we would hear about them, screaming when their parents were being taken away, and then being reassured that no, your mom's going to come back and get you, and then at night under dark of cover being taken to, put into vans with blacked out windows, and then taken to airport tarmacs and being put on buses with blacked out windows, and then taken across state lines by companies, presumably, that we now know were hired by the U.S. government and taken to entirely different states, where they would say that, they'd get to a bus station in that new state, and then the kids would be split up into different vans, and then the vans would go from one place to another until, the kids that we were interviewing, for example, were the kids who were taken to the Walmart. And they talked about the kids who were taken to all these different places on the way, even though they crossed the border in California or Arizona, and they're now in Texas, on the eastern edge of Texas, where we're interviewing them about what had happened. And so there's this incredibly traumatic journey that they've gone on, since they've been separated from their parents. So let's talk about, the things that have been done legally to try and protect these children and their rights, and to try and end the trauma that they're being subjected to when they arrive in the United States. One that you've probably all heard about is the Mizell versus ICE. This was a lawsuit, a class action suit that was brought by the ACLU, and this was to end the routine practice of family separation. We have always in recent history had family separation for kids arriving to the United States under 3 circumstances. The first circumstance is that the purported parents are not really the parents, that we have, the government has strong evidence that this does not look right to us. This person appears to be a trafficker, whatever it is, but there's something that is not right about the situation, and they want to protect the child. It was not punitive. It was to protect the child from being trafficked. The second reason is if the child appeared to be abused or neglected beyond the normal neglect that a child is going to experience because of, traveling for a number of days or weeks through the most dangerous migration journey on the planet. And the third was if the parent was a known felon to the U.S. authorities and was being taken into criminal custody because of their criminal activities. When I say known felon, I want to remind everyone that it is perfectly legal to come into the United States for the purpose of claiming asylum. That is allowed Under U.S. law, it is allowed under international law. So that does not make you a felon to come to the United States without documentation if the purpose of your arrival is to claim asylum. It is illegal to come to the United States without proper documentation if you're coming for any other reason. However, the first time you do it, it is a misdemeanor equal to playing your music too loud. So these are not justifications to take people away from their parents. When I say they're a known felon, I mean like real felon, not like, oh, they came across the border, they don't have documentation, and it's, and so it is illegal, but again, not the kind of illegal that normally would place someone in prison, or in jail, any kind of criminal detention. But in any event, so the ACLU saw what we all came to understand and that some of us knew before the public knew, that on an almost universal basis, every single child coming to the United States was being taken away from their parents, during the land crossings, and that there were not only records not being kept of which children belonged with which parents, but that the staff, the government workers who did create records of which children went with which parents, because those government workers were so morally distressed about what they were being ordered to do, were told by DC to destroy the records. And so you have a situation where literally you had thousands of children being sent all over the country, and the US government was taking the position publicly saying, once we take your child away, we have no way to get them back to you. And it was documented in the White House records that we obtained after the fact, that this was an intentional practice in order to create fear for people coming to the United States so that they would stop coming. You saw my opening graphs, right? How well did that work? Consistent with the research, it had the opposite effect and led to exactly what the expert in this area, could have told us. So in any event, so Mizell versus ICE, was intended to have the government stop separating children from their parents on a routine basis. And for the first time in judicial history, we had a federal judge who said, you do not have to be a U.S. citizen to enjoy a right to family unity, that everybody in the United States has a right to be with their family members, and that the United States cannot, suspend that right without due process, which was not what was happening in this case. And so the court ordered that those families start to be reunited. As of now, thousands of the kids have been reunited with their families. However, there are several hundred who were, recognized as being separated, where we've never found where the parents went. And we don't know where they are because they were just sent randomly to another country. And so we do have those children who are separated and likely to be separated indefinitely. And then we also have other families who were separated before this lawsuit started, and others who were not captured in this lawsuit. And those families, to our knowledge, have not been intentionally reunited. In addition to that lawsuit, we also have the lawsuit that I was able to help with. This is the Flores case, and this case was brought by one of my mentors when I was a baby attorney. And in this lawsuit, basically in the 1980s, that the attorneys found out about children who, just like today, were children arriving to the United States, didn't have proper documentation, and they were being kept in, one of them, Jenny Lisette Flores, was being kept in an abandoned hotel with strange adults, including men, that, she was being subjected to strip searches, no educational opportunities, never being let go. They would not release her to a family member. The ICE was taking the position that no, this is actually the precursor to ICE. But the INS was saying, we will only release you to your parents, and the idea was that she was being held as bait, so that the parents would come and then they'd arrest the whole family and deport them. In addition to Jenny Flores, there also was another named plaintiff in this class action suit, and she was being subjected not only to strip searches, but she was also being subjected to cavity searches, including vaginal searches by INS and CBP employees. And so, based upon these circumstances, which were, very horrendous, the United States over the next 10 years engaged in some litigation. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court and all the way back down again, and sometimes the kids won and sometimes the U.S. government won, until finally the kids' attorneys and the government attorneys sat down together and they said, let's agree on a few things. Let's agree that where you put these kids will be safe, sanitary, and appropriate for children. It's not brain science, not controversial, doesn't appear to be anything partisan. Like, let's just make sure that kids are safe, sanitary, and in appropriate facilities. Specifically, they said, we're going to make sure that the kids have access to toilets and sinks, drinking water, food, medical assistance, appropriate temperature controls, adequate supervision, and that they'll have contact with family members who were arrested with a child, but that they're going to be, they're going to be kept apart from adults who are not related to them. In addition to that, the final component of Flores that was so critical is that the children were to be released. And it wasn't up to the U.S. government to decide to whom the children were going to be released. It was set out in Flores, and to the extent that it wasn't set out in Flores, it was going to be left up to the parents. So the children are supposed to be released to their parents. If there are no parents in the United States, then they're supposed to be released to other adult relatives living in the United States. If there's no other adult relative living in the United States, then they're supposed to be released to another adult living in the United States who's authorized by the parents. And that's that 89% that I was talking about, is that basically almost all these kids fall into those first three categories. So we really don't need all these kids being kept in these facilities. But in any event, only if none of those are available do we want to have, do we need the kids to be in a licensed program. So of course that wasn't happening, because here we are, 25 years later, and we're having to bring temporary restraining orders based on, the kids being kept in Clint, kids that we were also being, seeing in the Rio Grande sector and other places, but this dealt specifically with the really horrendous conditions that were leading to children dying that we were documented in June 2019. And we also were having to do things like file with the UN Human Rights Council complaints relying on the children's sworn testimonies about what was going on to them. So we now have a situation where we are now releasing the kids more quickly than we were under the previous administration. However, we're now seeing that some of the people that the kids are being released to are labor traffickers. And so now you have kids who are in the United States, should be with family or other loved ones, but instead, we're hearing reports about dozens of kids being dropped off at the same address in Florida, that someone should be paying attention to the fact that this is not a normal family situation, and we need to do a better job of caring for these kids. And we, of course, are hearing about the tremendous trauma and physical suffering that some of these kids experience, and how they are unable to go to school, those that are able to go to school, that they're exhausted, and that some kids are literally being injured, and they're working in environments where people are sometimes dying, that they're often not receiving wages, and they're certainly not being allowed to be the children that they are meant to be, and they're losing that strength and resilience that made them such a gift to our country. And then of course we have problems with children even receiving basic services like medical care. And so what we'd like to see is, when children come to the United States and they first arrive, that we have child appropriate facilities that are age appropriate for them, that they can step into, and that we can identify who is this child, who are they with. If they're not with someone, who are they supposed to be with in the United States? If there's no one that they're supposed to be with in the United States, and there's not an appropriate place for them to go, to get them to their family safely, in their home country or wherever it is that their family is who can take care of them. And to the extent that they are, to stay in the United States, that we provide them with wraparound services, that we provide them with access to education, that we provide them with access to health care, that we provide them with an attorney who can determine what their rights are to remain in the United States, if they have some, and then to present the evidence of their right to remain in the United States to the court. But of course, that's not what's happening now, and that's one of the reasons why those advantages that this population of kids had when they arrived in the United States are lost in those first 2 years. So I'd like to now open this up to questions and discussion.
Is there any good news? Yeah, they're inspecting. Right, you're going.
No, actually, that's not what's happening. So right now, the Biden administration is trying to sunset Flores so that no inspectors are able to go to the facilities anymore, and they've assured us that they can take care of it and make sure that these kids are being well taken care of by the administration, whichever administration is in place. Of course, the decision in ICE is not a permanent decision. You know, that was, you know, what we call an order. It's not a judgment. And so that case is still open and active. And we have an order that says that children should not be separated from their parents routinely. But with the new administration, that could change again. So the good news. So what I always say is that, so I just because I do children's rights, like, you know, today I was working on a statement about Israel and Hamas and, you know, and Hamas and I sometimes work in war zones and, you know, on situations in war zones, and I have worked in war zones and stuff like that. And it's just like, you know, what is the good news? Like, what keeps you going? And I, growing up, hated Mr. Rogers. My little sister watched Mr. Rogers. And yet, I so often look for the good people. And I look for the helpers. And I think, you know, I need to see points, you know, I don't want to use somebody else's words, but I need to see, you know, hope and light in other people. And then I can play off of that, and I can try and shine back to them. And I can try and shine for these children by seeing them and hearing them and amplifying their voices and helping to tell their stories. And everywhere I look, I see goodness, I see helpers, I see good people. And even when I, for example, was at the tent city, that tent city was staffed by 9/11 first responders. There were police officers there. There were firefighters there. There were nurses there. They hated being there because they felt tricked. They are America's heroes, and they did not feel like heroes locking up a bunch of kids for months and months in the middle of the desert. And they did not renew that contract. Like, once they found out that Tornillo was created, the tent city was created to open up space in these other facilities so that kids could be kept there longer, that they realized that they were being used. And when the previous administration said, what do you mean you don't want to renew this, you know, the contract was worth over $100 million. What do you mean? And, you know, and they said, what would it take? We'll double it, you know, we'll increase it, we'll double it. And literally the executive director of the nonprofit that ran that tent city said, there is no price that we are willing to accept to torture children in that way. Like, that's the good news, is that you have people who are standing up and saying, no, not in my life, not in my work, not with my colleagues, not with my nonprofit. And so that's the good news, is that you're here, that I'm here, you know, and that there are people on the front lines, and that we can stand up and say, this is not okay. It's not okay to hurt children. I don't care if you're the government. I don't care, you know, if you are the military. I don't care if you're Border Patrol. Like, whatever your job is, it is never okay to intentionally hurt children, not to send messages to other people to stay in your countries, et cetera, and so on. And so that's what the good news is that you and I are here and that we can look to each other and find hope.
Have there been any longitudinal studies? I realize it's just been a year or so. Sorry. Have there been any studies going back to the thousands of kids that have been reunited with their families? And are there any systemic opportunities to watch how those kids can develop?
So so yes and no. So I wanted to create like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for this population, and what I found is that people were too scared to come forward from this population and talk about what had happened to them, and so we weren't able to ever get it off the ground. But part of our goal was to connect those families with medical and behavioral health supports, and to see how they do over time, assuming they agreed to participate in research. And one of the things that I was told at the time is that I didn't need to worry about that because there were other people doing this research. Not the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but there were people who were studying this population. I have not seen that research published yet, but I was told that it's out there, which is why, or being done, which is why I say yes and no. Yeah.
What can people like us do to help?
So here is what is so hard for me, is that like so many of us have to see it with our own eyes to believe it. Like we say that can't possibly be true, the U.S. government is going to make like little kids sleep on a concrete floor in a jail cell. And it's like there comes a point where not everybody can go to the front lines and see it yourself. And so the first thing to do is, to have a healthy skepticism. But when you see enough children's sworn testimonies entered into the legal record in a class action suit, and they're consistent across time and place, trust what the kids are telling you. And then it's to recognize that we are so close to losing civilization on a perpetual basis. Like, we are never secure in our ability to be free and to take care of each other in a civilized and compassionate society. And so do not ever take for granted that we can afford to throw away our vote, not for a single election. That we need to make sure that we have the most humane, compassionate, sane. It's never gonna be perfect. I have never thought that any elected official that I've ever seen is perfect. Don't expect them to be perfect. Don't subject them to litmus tests. But really, whenever you have a choice, choose the more humane choice. And don't walk away because someone's not perfect in your eyes. And so, those are the most important things that I would say, is to make sure that you exercise the political power that you are privileged enough to have inherited. Because none of us have, or almost none of us have fought a direct war where we have fought to create a democratic society. Most of us, have inherited this privilege. And it's so critically important that we not take it for granted, because we are so close to losing, the democracy with all of its imperfections that we do have. So that's the number one thing I would say. Thank you.
That was Professor Warren Binford discussing the challenges faced by children arriving to the U.S. It was recorded October 13th, 2023 at UAS on the unceded territories of the Occoquan on Tlingit as part of the 2023 Juneau World Affairs Forum, Immigration, Detention, and Power, Addressing Bias and Prejudice. Produced by KTOO and the Juneau World Affairs Council in partnership with the University of Alaska Southeast, with support from Poor Alaska Kensington Mine and Ramada by Wyndham.